Good afternoon. And may I say it's a great joy for Violet and I to be with you today. I very much appreciate the prayers of many of you over the past year, and delighted that Violet has made such a remarkable recovery. And we thank you for your prayer fellowship. Could we turn this afternoon to Hebrews chapter 11? Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 23, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. Amen. May the Lord bless the reading of his word today. There must have been hushed tones as that baby boy was born, as the midwives, probably Shiphrah and Puah, gathered together in that room and said in hushed tones, "It's a boy." For the midwives, there were consequences. They had been ordered by Pharaoh to kill all baby boys at birth, but they, fearing God, feared God more than they feared Pharaoh, and so the boy was delivered. There must have been consequences for the parents. There must have been consequences for the community of Hebrews around them, because they had been ordered to throw every baby boy into the Nile in order that they may drown. But there, into that home, there was a baby boy born, and our first verse there in verse 23 talks about by faith, and probably it's talking about there the faith of the parents as they hid this child for 3 months and they brought it up. He didn't have a name at this stage that we know of, but this baby was introduced into a godless world. We have that probably inferred by the fact that the name of God is not mentioned in Exodus chapter 1, and we get to Exodus chapter 2, verse 25, before we hear the mention of God. There had been silence for 400 years. We often refer to the silence between the Old Testament and the New Testament, but there had been silence between the time of Joseph at the end of Genesis and Genesis chapter 50 and Exodus story, when this new king arose who knew not Joseph. 400 years, and the people were not only subject to this genocide, but they had been put into severe slavery, and they were made to work hard, and these were brutal times. What kind of world were they bringing their little boy into? They would wonder. Over the last 2 weeks, we've been in Seattle. We just got home on Thursday, and I'm a bit jet lagged, I would confess, but there I had the great privilege of holding a little baby boy, Daniel McLatchie. What a boy. It says there that Moses' parents saw he was a beautiful child, and I know how they felt. But as you know, nothing could really take away the joy of holding that child. But just for a few moments, as I was holding him, I began to wonder, what kind of world have we brought this baby boy into? What is he facing in his life when he goes to school? And probably from a very early age at school will be taught about the fact there's no distinction between genders. given a secular sex education, brought into a world where you dare not claim that God created the heavens and the earth. I know a young man very well who was taken off his master's studies at university because he was publicly saying that God created the heavens and the earth. Where there's secular pressure, where there is a new king that knows not Joseph. And into this world we bring children, and it's by faith that Moses' parents brought him up, and it's by faith that we should be praying for families that in the Auchinleck community and other churches, because these are hard times to be bringing up children. But they brought him up, and what an influence they had on him. We can never underestimate the value of parental input. Susanna Wesley was the 24th child of a 25-child family. Her father married twice, and she was the 24th child, and then she had 19 children. 10 of them survived to adulthood. Among them, Charles and John Wesley. And John Wesley said he learned more from his mother's knee than he learned from all the theologians in England. And parents are bringing up children, and of course there were unusual circumstances in that particular family back in Egypt, that they hid the child in the Nile. Quite a clever scheme, because they were told to put all the baby boys into the Nile, and they put the baby boy into the Nile, but within an ark. And of course, you know the story. Was it coincidence, or was it God's providence that Pharaoh's daughter happened to be coming along the Nile, and she went over and she opened the basket, and the baby cried, and she received the child and brought the child up as her own child. And Moses received the best education. Acts chapter 7, Stephen recounts, summarizes the life of Moses, and he says that Moses received all the Egyptian education and was mighty in word and in deed, and he received that education. I often wonder if, having such learning, it was enabled him, together with God's Spirit, to be able to write the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And they brought this child Moses up to be a colossus of a figure. He wrote 20% of the Bible. Sometimes maybe you've never thought of this, but I wondered who had written the biggest percentage of the Bible. And Paul wrote about 34,500 words. Moses wrote 135,000. Moses is not only mentioned in the Old Testament, he's mentioned 80 times in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Jude, Revelation. You read the story of Moses, you look at John's gospel, and he features throughout, and the story of the Exodus. And if you don't understand the story of Moses and the story of Exodus, then the New Testament will become fairly flat to you, because John starts off in chapter 1, the law came by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. Philip finds Nathanael, and he says to him, this is the one of whom Moses spoke. You come to great verses like, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness. You have, the comparison in John chapter 6 of Moses sent down manna from heaven. I am the bread of life, and so on. And we could be here all afternoon going through the scriptures. He's compared, or rather contrasted with Christ in Hebrews chapter 3. We have him mentioned here in Hebrews 11. The last song recorded is the Song of Moses in the book of Revelation. And Moses is a colossus of a figure, and inputting to that life were his parents. They had the privilege of bringing him up, and in God's providence, they educated him. But, as I said earlier, 400 years had passed and Moses was born. 400 years of silence had passed and a baby was born in Bethlehem. 40 years passed of silence when the people of Israel were oppressed by the Midianites, and Samson was born. In the days when the word of the Lord was scarce, there was a little boy called Samuel born. And so it is that very often, God's ways of rescuing the people are through babies being born. And that's why we should be, praying for them. We often pray for those outside, but let's pray for our own families at this time. They badly need protection in God's ways. This afternoon, I want to look at the life of Moses from Hebrews chapter 11. I don't have clever alliteration. I've just picked out the verbs from verse 24, refusing. And then verse 25, choosing. And then verse 26, esteeming. And verse 27, enduring or persevering. And in verse 28, keeping or obeying. And so it is that Moses was brought up to, when he came of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He had to take a stand, refuse. And, my little grandson's namesake, I hope he's a great example to him, Daniel. Remember the story of Daniel? Daniel purposed in his own heart that he would not defile himself with the king's meat. Or Daniel's friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they were threatened with the furnace, they said, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, our God is able to deliver us, but if not, let it be known to you that we will not bow down and we will not serve." As we face all sorts of pressures in our society, I think it's going to become increasingly necessary to refuse. I think of school children going to school today, and most secondary schools have these pink days. You've got to celebrate, LGBTQ, whatever diversity. There, even within the wider church movement, there is all sorts of peer pressure being applied, and we need to take a stand. There are people who today in the Western world are taking their stand. We think of the fact that these baby boys were thrown into the Nile, and it sounds so horrendous. But we think of 230,000 babies who never exit the womb. You think of an MP in Finland this week. She was Interior Minister. And when her church wanted to support the LGBT march in Finland, in Helsinki, she tweeted a picture of a verse from Romans chapter 1. And she is up in court this week, threatened with possible imprisonment. We think of an MP in Mexico who last week was in court. In Mexico, they have a 50-50 gender split for representatives in the House of Parliament. They have 50% female, 50% male. And in order to fill the quota, males are now identifying as females. And he questioned this. And this week he received a criminal record, meaning that he's no longer able to run for Parliament. These are the consequences that, you know, they are far away, but they're fast closing in Scotland. And even being able to stand in certain areas and pray silently in your own head is now bringing the attention of the police. Moses refused. He had the reputation. He had the prestige. Imagine being part of the royal family, being in Buckingham Palace, and all the privileges that go along with that. But when he was growing up, Moses refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Rather, he chose to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. He chose to take a stand, and we are called to take a stand and, you know, for the gospel, and we're not called to be politicians or whatever, but we're chosen. We have to, you know, in the words of Joshua, choose you this day with whom you'll stand. And he made a choice to suffer affliction with the people of God. This was part of the problem, I think, in the Hebrew audience to which Paul was writing in Hebrews chapter 10. He said, you know, there was a time when you would have plucked out your own eyes for zeal, and, you know, you took a stand with those who were imprisoned and those who were oppressed, and you visited those in prison and so on, and you took a stand with these people, but they seemed to have become soft, and they were not persevering, and they were not enduring, and they were going back the way rather than forward. He says, choose this day with whom you'll stand. There's a man called Martin Luther in 1521, just over 500 years ago, faced at the Diet of Worms there, and all the Vatican and all the bishops pointing their fingers at him, asking him to recant. And he said, here I stand. I can do no other. You know, there is a situation where Egypt, the world of Egypt, can enter into our sort of comfort zone, isn't there? We think of Abraham, who went down to Egypt, probably made a mistake, I think, going down to Egypt. The Bible doesn't explicitly say so, but I think, you know, he was told to go to Canaan, and there was a famine, and he went down to Egypt. But, you know, he went down there, and unfortunately, Lot became influenced by Egypt. Remember when Abraham asked him to choose which part of land? Lot chose the well-watered plains that were similar to Egypt. Abraham married Hagar, and Hagar was an Egyptian. And there are many things that attract us about Egypt. We think of the children of Israel as they were there in the desert and they were fed up with manna and the provision of quails and so on. And they thought of all the multitude of fish and the cucumber and the leeks and the garlic and all the rich food they had in Egypt, and they wanted to go back there. But Moses was resolute and stood for the Lord. Choose you this day whom you will serve. You'll all have heard the conversation between Henry Varley and D.L. Moody. Henry Varley said, the world has yet to see what God can do with a life that is fully consecrated to him. D.L. Moody said, by God's grace, I will be that man. He made a choice, he made a stand. And so not only did Moses refuse, not only did he choose, but he esteemed the riches of Christ to be greater value than the treasures of Egypt, for he had respect unto the reward. The word esteem is a similar word to the word estimate. It's a kind of accounting term. I often wonder if the Apostle Paul had a background in finance. He often talks about gains and losses, doesn't he? In Philippians chapter 3, he said, I've suffered the loss of all things for the sake of knowing Christ. He says, and I count all these things that I once thought gain, now but loss. And it's replaced with the surpassing gain of knowing Christ. I want to know him. And he's this hunger for Christ. And so it is that when perhaps Moses was balancing these things up in his life, we've got on the one hand affliction with the people of God. We've got the reproach of Christ being associated with him. On the other hand, we've got the treasures of Egypt and the pleasures of sin which last for a season. We've got this sort of balancing act. He estimated, oh yes, he said, the riches of Christ are of far greater value than the treasures of Egypt. For he had respect unto the reward. A lot of people say, I'm looking forward to going to heaven. But even if I get to the end of the journey as a Christian and discover there's no heaven, it will have been worth it to have lived a life as a Christian. I'm not sure that the Apostle Paul would agree with you. In 1 Corinthians 15, he says, if in this life only we have hope, we are of all men most miserable. We do have hope. We do have a prospect of reward. And that's what keeps us going. He estimated the treasures of Christ to be of far the greater value than the treasures of Egypt. Must have been so encouraging to receive a letter from Peter. Those saints who were scattered abroad, they'd once been in Jerusalem, but now they were in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, and so on. They were spread out throughout Asia, and they had left their homes and their families, etc., because of the reproach of Christ. And they received this letter from Peter, and he said, there is stored up for you an inheritance that is incorruptible and undefiled, and it's reserved in heaven for you. It's not like the treasures of Egypt. Anyone who has been in the stock market over the last few years know how temporary the treasures of Egypt are. But Moses looked forward to the reward. And I think that's why this fits into this part of Hebrews. If perhaps you will bear with me and just turn back to Hebrews chapter 10, as I was referring to earlier. Let's just read some verses from verse 32. But recall the former days in which, after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings, partly because you were made a spectacle, both by the reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you became companions of those who were so treated. For you had compassion on me in my chains, joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and an enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. Therefore, do not cast away your confidence, which has great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. For yet a little while, and he who is coming will come and will not tarry. And so he introduces them to a plethora of heroes in Hebrews chapter 11, people who were looking for a city whose builder and maker was God. They were not seeking a homeland in this earth. And he goes on in Hebrews chapter 11 to read, to give us a big list of people who were sawn and asunder, who were, stopped the mouth of lions, who lost everything, who were destitute and homeless and naked and so on in Hebrews chapter 11. And they did not receive the reward in this life, but they were looking for a world that is to come. This world is not our home. We are just a passing through. And it should give us the correct perspective of how much weight and how much attachment we put on the treasures in Egypt. He would rather suffer reproach with Christ. The reproach of Christ was far greater value than the treasures of Egypt, for he had respect unto the reward. There was an old missionary couple came back from Africa, and they arrived back in, I think it was 1940s, and not sure of my American history, but Teddy Roosevelt was president, and he was arriving off the same ship in New York, and he had been out game hunting in Africa, shooting elephants and lions and so on, and here he was returning, and there was a great crowd at New York Harbor to welcome the president home. This couple who had served the Lord in Africa and had returned home to retire looked over the pier side, and they didn't recognize anyone from their home church or whatever to welcome them. And they went home alone, and the bus arrived back, and they felt sorry for themselves. And the man was so disappointed that nobody had been there, and he went through to his room and then returned a short time later. And he said, it was almost as if I heard a voice in that bedroom. You're not home yet. You're not home yet. There is a reward. The treasures of Christ, the riches of Christ, or the treasures of Egypt. Jim Elliot said, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. So not only did Moses refuse and choose and esteem, but Moses persevered. He forsook Egypt. I've read some historians and commentaries, and they refer to the works of Josephus, and perhaps there's a suggestion that at this time Moses thought of stirring up a rebellion when he struck down the Egyptian and he buried him in the sand. And he was, preemptive. He had all this education. He had leadership skills. There's a hint that he had military skills, and perhaps he was planning to rebel and lead at that stage, the children of Israel out of Egypt by his own efforts. And while Moses buried a man in the sand and covered him up, he had to learn to wait on God, who buried the whole Egyptian army in the sea. And he had to go in God's time. But he decided to forsake Egypt and go, and he went to the land of Midian because of the pressure. So we look forward to the fact that, along with these Hebrew believers, we are encouraged in Hebrews chapter 12 to run the race that is set before us. And Hebrews chapter 12 makes it very clear it's an endurance race. Throw off every weight that holds you back, and every sin that weighs you down, and run with endurance and perseverance the race that is set before you, looking unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith. I was always a great sprinter. I represented the school, I would have in the 100 meters. I was absolutely hopeless at marathons. And I think it's a marathon race that is in mind here in Hebrews chapter 12. It's an endurance race. And so it is that Moses forsook Egypt. He endured and he carried on. He persevered as seeing him who is invisible. Isn't it remarkable that Moses saw him who is invisible? As I quoted earlier, Philip said to Nathanael, "This is the one of whom Moses spoke about." It says in John chapter 5, the Lord said to them, if you had read the scriptures, Moses spoke about me. In Luke chapter 24, those two on the road to Emmaus, that the Lord walked with them. And while he was walking with them, he opened unto them the scriptures beginning at Moses and in all the prophets, the things concerning himself. And Moses was looking forward to the Lord Jesus. And he saw in type, that Passover lamb. He was given instructions for the tabernacle, and everything, in his life was pointing to that one who was invisible. And that's why it's said of Moses time and time again here. I think the words by faith are mentioned 5 times in the verses I read. By faith, by faith, by faith, by faith, by faith. He saw him who was invisible. And we look unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith, who endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the majesty on high. And during those days when Moses was a boy in Egypt, the people began to get oppressed, and they weighed up their situation before God, and their cry reached God. It says in Exodus chapter 2, verse 23, and God heard their groanings and their cries for help. And then it uses 4 verbs of God. And God heard. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham. And God saw his people. And God knew. And they cried unto God. They had not cried unto God like that in the comfortable times. But they begin to cry unto God. They think, God is silent and God is vacant in the situation. But this God had all the time been working in the background in providence by raising this child Moses and giving him a training. And Moses went to serve the Lord. Need to watch time, but it's keeping and obeying. It says, by faith, Moses kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who killed the firstborn should touch them. He kept. He was an obedient man. It tells us in Hebrews chapter 3 that Moses was faithful over all his house. He was a man, he wasn't a perfect man by any means, and we read quite a lot about the faults of Moses, but he was a man who was obedient. If you come to Exodus chapter 40, when it talks about the tabernacle being built, and it talks about Moses placing the furniture in the tabernacle 8 times over, you'll see this phrase, and Moses did as the Lord commanded. And Moses did as the Lord commanded. And Moses did as the Lord commanded. And God is looking for obedience. He kept. He was faithful. A good friend, Ian Wallace, left a wee note in his Bible. Said, God said it. I believe it. That settles it. He obeyed. I think perhaps Moses was now ready at the age of 40 to lead the people. Certainly, I think he thought he was ready to lead a rebellion. And we should not mistake God's equipping for God's timing. He was presumptuous. He went ahead of God. He had to leave Egypt. He had all this education. James Phillips said that he had trained to be a lawyer. He had trained to be a leader in Egypt. But it took 40 years to teach him how to be a shepherd. And he spent 40 years learning to be a shepherd because he would have 40 years ahead of him shepherding the children of Israel through the wilderness. First Corinthians chapter 10 talks about Moses and his relevance to us. Talks about, how the people were baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And then Paul goes on in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 to say, these things were written as an example to us, that we should not be idolaters as they were, that we should not test Christ as they did, that we should not grumble as they did. And these things were written for our learning. And the Old Testament is so applicable. As I said earlier, we don't really understand the New Testament until we get into the likes of the book of Exodus and look at the life of Moses and so on. But there Moses is looked for God. And sometimes we can blunder in, can't we? Remember in Mark chapter 1, there's a story of a leper who came to the Lord Jesus and he was healed. And the Lord said to him, now, I don't want you to tell anyone about this. Keep it to yourself for now. And I suppose we all can sympathize with the leper. I've been healed from leprosy, and it's such a great news story. I want to tell everyone that I can't contain this to myself. And he went out and he started to tell everyone about his healing for leprosy. And, as a result of that, it tells us that Christ could do no ministry in that city because of all the publicity, and Christ could not go into that city. And sometimes we, as I said, go before God, we blunder our way. And Moses was one who trusted the Lord, as had to learn to trust the Lord. And the Lord said to him, now you've had all the teaching of Egypt, and I will teach you what to say. There's often a comparison between Isaiah and Moses. Both saw the holiness of God. Moses saw the holiness of God in the burning bush. Take the sandals from off your feet, for the ground you stand on is holy ground. And then in Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah has this great vision, and he hears those words, holy, holy, holy is the Lord. And Isaiah said, here am I, send me. And Moses said, who am I? Send someone else. And I wonder if that could be our sort of attitude as I conclude this part. We're into VAR time in terms of the 5 to 4 deadline. But, we see the need around us, and we leave it to someone else. And throughout 40 years of training, Moses learned. His life is often summarized as first 40 years, Moses thought he was somebody. For the next 40 years, he learned he was nobody. And then the next 40 years, he learned what God can do with somebody who's a nobody. And God led him. The story of Exodus is not the story of how Moses led the people of God out of Egypt and through the Red Sea, but it's profoundly a story of how God led the people of Israel out of Egypt. 2 million people or so, we suppose, led out of Egypt in one night through God's miraculous deeds. Just want to conclude with a quotation from E.F. Bounds, if I can find it. Yeah, I've left it behind. But E.M. Bounds wrote, I think, 3 books on prayer: Necessity of Prayer, The Power of Prayer, and The Essentials of Prayer. And he starts off one of these books by saying what the church is looking for today is bigger organizations and newer methods and more plans. But God does not fall upon organizations, and God does not fall upon methods, and God does not fall upon plans, but God uses men of prayer, men who through the Holy Ghost pray. That's who God uses today. And so may we learn our utter dependence upon God, as Moses did 3,500 years ago. And I hope this message is relevant for us in Auchinleck in 2023. Thank you.